So next I'm going to talk about the index itself, its development, and what has happened since the original pilot, where we are now, how it's being used, and then I'll talk about some more recent developments. So in one of your handouts, there's a page called WEAI versions table. It's this one. The following table summarizes different versions of WEAI. So this one would have some information of the different flavors. And just to let you know that you have it there, and I'll go over what those new versions are later. We'll end with trying to answer the question, which version should I use? Because when the first video was developed and released, that was at the launch of the index, which was about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 2012. It has evolved since then, and so there have been some changes, there's some new developments. So we'll go over that in the end. Okay. So as we heard, the purpose of the index was to design, develop, and test an index to measure the inclusion of women in agricultural sector growth. And this was designed as a monitoring and evaluation tool for the Feed the Future initiative. So we had, the developers of this tool had that goal in mind. This was their original task. So the idea was to try to they needed a tool that would help them understand whether or not their projects were having, or their programs were having the intended effect. So now when IFPRI was approached to be part of this team that was to develop this index, they initially said no, and I can say this because Agnes has said this publicly before. And the reason they did that was that they thought it was a monumental task. It's difficult because empowerment is such a multidimensional, complicated notion that how would you even begin, right, to try to capture that in a number, the index. So it was really a big challenge, but they took it on. So in the end, they ended up sort of taking the challenge on and coming up with a new measure. So the definition of empowerment that's used in the index, our working definition, is that empowerment is expanding people's ability to make strategic life choices, particularly in contexts in which this ability had been denied to them. So this is a definition that draws from the work of Naila Kabir. Now, there were a lot of critics of the index, and those criticisms are fair, because precisely because of the difficulty in capturing such a complicated sort of idea into one number, but also we talked about context specificity just in the past hour in the last presentation, how gender norms and these are so context specific and varies from place to place. How could we possibly come up with a cross-country comparable tool that measures empowerment? So there are a lot of challenges around this. Empowerment is personal, it's context specific, it's hard to measure. So what do we do? And should we do it, right? Now, luckily for us, the reason we have this tool is that they actually decided to take it on, and what convinced them was that they realized that even though our tools are flawed or imperfect, we still have to try to measure. Because if we don't try to measure it, we won't know what's working. We can't monitor success. And if we don't know what's working, we'll keep making the same mistakes over and over again. We won't discover the good ideas, the ones that work. So it was so important to start somewhere. So let's try something and do our best effort, come up with a tool. But of course, recognizing that this is a tool that's constantly under development, right? As people use them, we've learned a lot about implementation. We've learned a lot about what it's capturing and what it can do. And with the help of all those people who are interested in measuring empowerment, we get ideas on how to make it better. So this is a continuous process of improving the tool. So a key aspect of the index is its methodology. Sabina Al-Khair, who you saw in the video, is the director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. They're the index people. They were the ones who developed what's called the Multidimensional Poverty Index. And that index is based on the Alcar-Foster method. We'll go into that method in more detail. I don't know if we'll do it by end of the day, but definitely we'll talk about it tomorrow. So just as a brief sort of intro, and we'll get into this more tomorrow. So it's based on the Alcar-Foster methodology of multidimensional poverty, and it's innovative. What's innovative about the index is that it uses interviews of two people in the household, the primary male and the primary female adults in the same household. So you could have a measure of gender parity. It gives you an intra-household measure of how far, what is the gap between the empowerment of the woman and the man. People talk all the time about, oh, you know, women are disadvantaged in this, disadvantaged in that. This actually tells us by how much and in which domains. So that's new about this index. So, the other thing that's innovative or interesting about the index is that the focus is strictly on empowerment in agriculture, very important. There's a focus in agriculture, and this is distinct from economic status, education, and empowerment in other domains. There have been other measures of empowerment, you know, in the literature, but none of those focus on agriculture. So that was the dilemma of Feed the Future. They wanted to understand if their projects worked, but the existing data and tools at the time did not focus on agriculture. That's why they decided to do a tool that focuses on agriculture. Now, also, you know, usually because there was no data before they developed the index, there wasn't a lot of data around direct measures of empowerment. There were measures of economic status, women's education. So they would use that as proxies to measure women's empowerment. So an educated woman is more likely to be empowered than a non-educated woman, for example. But in this index, they deliberately excluded those measures because they want to understand, is education really correlated with empowerment in agriculture? And because it's distinct from that, you can actually do an analysis. So that has both pluses and minuses. But that's the main advantage. It's also it also is distinct from empowerment in other domains. So like I said, you know, like the DHS collects the decision-making questions on a bunch of activities and domains, but those have been, I think, used, you know, in other studies, and you could certainly combine them. So for example, if domestic violence was an issue or was something of interest, you could sort of draw on other tools that have been used, that have been validated on collecting information on that, and then use that in conjunction with the WEAI. So this index is not intended to be the be-all and end-all of empowering measurement. It measures a very specific slice or, you know, subset of domains in empowerment that's relevant to agriculture. And the idea is not that you use just this, but that you complement it with other information when you have it. If there's a DHS in your country, use that information if it's relevant. If there are other surveys that collect other domains of empowerment and that's useful, for example, mobility can be very important, like in South Asia, then use that or ask those additional questions. So don't expect the WEAI to be answering everything about empowerment in all the domains. It has a very specific focus. So the details on index construction is in this World Development Journal article, which you should have access to. And then we'll also go over this in more detail tomorrow. So just as a review, what makes up the index? So it's made up of two sub-indices. We have a sub-index called the 5 Domains of Empowerment, or 5DE. So this is a direct measure of women's empowerment in 5 domains, and I'll go over what those domains are shortly. And then, so that's 90% of the index. 10% of the index comes from what we call the Gender Parity Index. So this is an index that reflects women's achievements relative to the primary male in their household. So this is where the men's scores are included. So the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index is mostly composed of this. The data used for calculating the 5DE include both dual adult households, those with male and female, as well as female-only households. Could be de jure, could be de facto, but those that do not have a male respondent. All their scores go into here. For the Gender Parity Index, you need a male score. So if there's no male, you cannot calculate. So this is based on a smaller sample of what we call couple or dual adult households. So this has only dual adult households. Female-headed households are not included because they don't have a male to compare their scores with. So this is 10% of the index. So it's weighted lower precisely because it's only for the subset of couple-headed households. It's not everyone. Okay. So the overall index, the WEAI, what we're calling the WEAI, is a weighted average of these two. So 90% 5DE, 10% GPI. Now, so these are all indices. So the values range from 0 to 1, and higher values mean greater empowerment. They wanted a positive message. So you want higher numbers, you want to aspire for higher numbers. So higher numbers mean greater empowerment. Now that said, the methodology is actually based on poverty measurement. So, and you'll see this as we go along. When it's constructed, it focuses on disempowerment and inadequacies in achievements because that's how the measure is constructed. And then at the very end, we take 1 minus disempowerment to arrive at empowerment because that's what USAID wanted. I mean, they wanted empowerment they wanted empowerment, but it's actually the same thing. It's two sides of the same coin, right? 1 minus empowerment is disempowerment. 1 minus disempowerment is empowerment. So it's just a matter of perspective. All right. So when they did the pilot, and I don't think I have the pilot results here, but when they did the pilot, they got some numbers. There are pilot results that this is actually in that Altair Foster World Development paper. And that gives you a benchmark, right? So the pilots found these numbers. But I think for the index, it's really hard. It was a very new tool. So it was very hard to try to sort of have a reasonable expectation of what is a good number, right, to aspire to. So instead, I think what's more useful is to look at change. So if you do your baseline and you see it's 0.6 in this country and 0.7 in this country, after 5 years at the end of your project, you measure again, and this is now 0.7, and this is still 0.7. They're now the same number, but I would be more happy about this result because it means there was growth, there was improvement. So I think it helps you. The initial, just like any index, the initial number is not as helpful as the change over time. And that's the intention of this. The other thing is it was intended as a cross-country comparable tool. So you could look at the index, and I have a copy of the report here, the global report that has the results for the 13 baseline countries. This is available online, but I could, let me just try to show you actually I have it in a later slide, but I can circulate this. This is my last copy. So I'm going to look for it. It has to come back over here. But you could take a look. It's a very precious document. So you can take a look at this. But this is where the baseline is online. It is online. Yes, yeah, it is available online. Yes. So you can definitely download a copy. You already have it. Okay, perfect. So that's where that can give you an idea too what the ranges of values are based on the actual surveys. Okay. So okay, let's move on. So what are the 5 domains? So the 5 domains, as you heard, is production, resources, income, leadership, and time. So production, these are decisions about agricultural production, including sole or joint decision-making, power over food or cash crop farming. So why do we include production? We want to know if women have control over what to produce. We include resources because we want to know if they want to produce a certain crop, or they want to participate in a certain value chain. Do they have the resources to make that happen? Do they have land? Do they have credit? Do they have inputs? What they need to be able to do to undertake those productive decisions. Income. Do they control the benefits from their activity? If they participate in that value chain, will they be able to control the income generated out of that activity? Leadership. So this is participation in community decisions. Do they have, are they members of groups? Is there a way for them to participate in community decisions? Are they comfortable raising their concerns to the community? So there's an indicator about speaking up in public. Time. So the time domain, does she have enough time to undertake productive activities? Does she have enough time to take care of herself? Is she overworked? Is she time poor? So there are two indicators here. So all of those things those are the 5 domains that are captured in the index. So here we have the 5 domains. So production, resources, income, leadership, and time. The numbers you see next to the domain is the weight of that domain. So as you can see, they're all equally weighted. Each domain is measured by a set of indicators. So, and they range from 1 to 3. So for production, you have 2 indicators: input in productive decisions, autonomy in production. For resources, you have 3 indicators: ownership of assets, purchase, sale, or transfer of assets, and access to credit. For income, you have 1 indicator: control over the use of income. For leadership, you have 2: group membership and speaking up in public. And then for time, you have 2 indicators: satisfaction with leisure and workload. So what we have here, so the domains are equally weighted, and then within each domain, the set of indicators are equally weighted within the domain. So if you have 2 indicators, you divide the 1/5 weight across the 2, so you have 1/10 each. In resources, you have 3 indicators, so you divide the weight up by 3, so it's 1/15 each, and so on. Okay. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to say here was that so each of these indicators are scored. So based on the responses in the questionnaire, we use their responses to code these indicators as either achieving adequate achievement or inadequate achievement. So that's 0 and 1. And when we take the weighted sum of that, so using these weights, we take the weighted sum. So they are either adequate achievement or inadequate achievement in each of these 10 indicators. So it's 0 or 1s, and then you take the weighted sum of that, and that gives you an empowerment score, which summarizes their achievements in the 5 domains. So who is empowered? So who is empowered? Yeah. Right. So each of these indicators, based on the responses in the questionnaire, you determine whether or not it's 0 or 1, whether they're achieving it or not achieving it. And if they're achieving it, you can weight them by and then you take the weighted sum. So let's say, I have an example later, but the idea is that you take the weighted sum, and that will give you a score that will range from 0 to 1. So if you stack it up, it looks like this, right? So this is their score. So this person has a score. So the white part is this is the end of the score here. The ones with the colors tell you what the indicators are. So for this person, this is the person's score here, a little over 80%. So who is empowered? We define empowerment as a person who has achieved adequacy in 80% or more of the weighted indicators. So this person's score exceeds 80, so this person is empowered. If you stack up their scores and it's less than that, then they're disempowered. This is an assumption that's made in this is the definition. This is how they define. So 80% or more of the weighted indicators, meaning if you are empowered in 4 out of the 5 domains, you're empowered. So if you're just disempowered in 1, you're still empowered. If you're disempowered in 2 domains, then you're disempowered because your score will fall below. This is our empowerment cutoff, right? We're saying that the score has to be at a certain amount for them to be considered empowered. This is how we're identifying who's empowered and who's not. Okay. There's a lot more detail to this methodology. We'll get into it tomorrow. Okay, so example. So here's Lillian. She's from Uganda. And when we looked at her responses, all of these indicators in black, she has adequate achievement. In access to credit, she does not have decision-making over credit. She also is overworked, so she's time poor. So these things in red, these are zeros. These things in black, they're ones because she has adequate achievement. When we stack up her score is here, right? When we take the weighted average of her score is over 80%. So, very easy quiz question. Is Lillian empowered or disempowered? Oh, sorry. So easy. Is Seema empowered or disempowered? So here, she is disempowered. She has inadequate achievements in access to credit, group membership, speaking up in public and in her satisfaction with issues. So her score is here. Is she empowered or disempowered?
Empowered.
She disempowered.
She's disempowered.
Of course, 60. No, it's 60.
She's 60.
The bar is the
Oh,
So that's the part. Sorry.
This is the bar, yes.
Yeah.
disempowered.
The methodology of the index allows it to be decomposed by indicator and by domain. So it can tell you what is the contribution of this to her score. What is the contribution of this? And if you have limited resources in your programs, what should you focus on? If you wanted to raise her score, which of these should you address? You have limited, maybe suppose you can't do everything. So that's a very good point. Okay, let's move on. So that was just the 5DE, the 5 domains of empowerment. So now let's go to gender parity. What does gender parity measure? It measures the percentage of women who enjoy gender parity, or households, women in households with gender parity. So a woman has gender parity if, and this is important, she is empowered. So if, according to the previous rule, we already know that her score is empowered, we already assume that she's fine. We're not worried anymore about her gender parity. So we assume she has parity. That's an assumption. If she's not empowered, like Seema, her score is below 80, if she's not empowered, then we want to know, then she has parity if her husband's score is also low. So if her score is below, if she's not empowered, so let's say her score is 60, but her husband's score is also 60, their score is the same, they have parity, right? So we define her as she has parity. They're both disempowered, but they have parity, okay? So that's one part of the measure. The second part of the measure is what we call the empowerment gap. So among those who don't have parity, so if the score is not the same as the husband's, typically the husband would have higher score, right? Then what is the average percentage shortfall that a woman without parity experiences? So how far is her score from her husband? So it captures two things. Either, how many of the women have parity, and among those who don't have parity, how far is the score? How big is the gap? How far do we need to, does the empowerment score have to rise for them to catch up with their husband or the male in the household? Okay? So this part of the measure is actually based on if you're familiar with the poverty gap ratio, it's based on that. It's similar to that. That's the same methodology, except that the poverty line is the husband's score. So it's a different line for every household. Okay, so that's gender parity. Okay, so pilots. So in the first set of pilots, so before they scaled it up, they did pilots in 3 countries. Now, important to remember, especially because the Feed the Future population-based surveys are not nationally representative necessarily. They are based on their zone of influence. Remember, this was developed as a monitoring and evaluation tool for Feed the Future. So it was designed around their programming. So it's not nationally representative, it's representative of the zone of influence, with one exception, Bangladesh. Bangladesh actually collected it nationally. But that's not the requirement. Most people did not. So they did pilots in 3 countries, and they chose these countries, Bangladesh, Guatemala, Uganda. They wanted some variation in social cultural context because they wanted to make sure that when they say a chicken is a small asset, that this is something they can assume for different contexts. So about 20% of the samples were single female households. So they oversampled the female-headed households because they wanted to make sure they had enough of those to be able to make sure that the index performs well, even if you have a lot of female-headed households. So about 350 households, over 600 individuals per pilot survey. Okay, so this is the area for Bangladesh. I won't go into this into too much detail. Sample size here is about 450. So this is located in the southern part of the country. In Guatemala, it was the Western Highlands. Sample size about 350 households. And then in Uganda, it's a bit scattered. So you have northern, central, and eastern sort of districts. Sample size, again, is about 350 households. And here we have the breakdown of how many are dual adult versus female. As I said, they did some case studies too. These are qualitative interviews with narratives to explain the answers. Try to get at what the concept of empowerment was for these different respondents. Okay, limitations. It's an index. It has, think of every limitation you can think of about using an index, it applies here. So, just like any tool, it cannot, it has limitations. Now, specific to this tool, there are specific limitations as well. One is that if you have a woman who is engaged in non-agriculture, say she has a non-farm business. She's not involved in the farming, she's not involved. So she will appear disempowered because she's not empowered in agriculture. Does it mean she's disempowered in the same way as the other women? No, right? So that's one thing to worry about. So if you're looking at if your survey area, if your population has a lot of these types of livelihood activities, post-harvest processing that are not strictly, that do not get captured here, or if they have a government job and they're earning a good income, but they're not involved in any other thing, they would they would seem as if they're disempowered. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Second thing is that female-only households. So both the de jure as well as, I think the de facto especially, but even the de jure, both the de jure especially, but even the de facto. So even if you have a male in the picture, it could still be a problem. So female-only households are more likely to appear empowered because they're the ones at home, they're the ones making all the decisions because the husband is away, for example. Maybe you don't know if it's really empowering because maybe not all the decisions they want to take on. It's just that nobody else is there to make the other decisions, right? So it could make female-headed households appear more empowered because of this. The third thing is that it focuses on agriculture. That this may not capture other domains of empowerment that may be more relevant to certain outcomes. So, like we said, some places mobility is important or violence is important. There are other aspects of empowerment that could be crucial, but not in this index. So this index, remember, cannot capture all of those things. It is what it is. It only measures what's in the questionnaire. So that's all it can inform you on. And lastly, nuances behind domains not fully captured. So like I said, we want to be aware of what the norms are, what the context is, and to the extent that there are other things that may not be reflected. So maybe your responses, you're talking about joint decision making or joint ownership. Maybe there are types of ownership that's not a response category there, or maybe you cannot distinguish. How about common property? It's not there, or it's not clear. Actually, you could put it there, but maybe it's hard to pull it out. So you don't get the nuance. You can capture joint ownership. So I could say, I own this river or this forest with my community, but I cannot tell you. You cannot possibly enumerate all of that information in this small tool. So you're going to have to rely on other information as well to get a complete picture. Okay, so those are the limitations. How is the tool used? So like I said, Feed the Future is using it right now as a monitoring indicator. So they had rolled it out to 19 Feed the Future countries. They've collected their baselines. 13 of those baselines are summarized in this global report. So the first 13 are here, but they did collect it for the 19. They're doing right now an interim survey for part of their sample. So they're only interviewing women. They drop one indicator. So they're not doing the full WEAI, but they're doing some data collection for the interim. But in the end line, they will do it again so that they could have a change. They can try to see what happened to the index over time. Number two, it's really interesting to use it as a diagnostic. So if you use it early enough in your project that you can use it to inform the priorities in the project, that's really, really, I think, where it's helpful. Because when you look at what the contributions are to this empowerment, that gives you an idea of what to focus on. what to target. So it can help you design your programs better. So if, for example, you go in and you didn't realize that you're doing let's say you wanted to deliver some new technology, some high value crops or whatever through groups, and then you discover that women are not members of groups. How are you going to deliver your training if you're trying to deliver it to groups? So that's a problem, right? So you could use the information there to try to tell you, okay, you may want to redesign or think about other ways to narrow those gaps, narrow those constraints to make sure you have equitable participation and equitable benefits. And then the last thing is an analysis. So we're using the tool to do, research. It's being used in impact evaluations. We're looking at how the different indicators correlate with various outcomes. I think we've shared papers on Bangladesh, Ghana, and Nepal, where we looked at the relationship between the different indicators with various outcomes of dietary diversity, nutrition outcomes for kids, I think we have food security outcomes as well. So you could actually look at the relationship between this and any other sort of outcome that you're interested in. So it's very useful for analysis. So it can do that as well as have the high level. Okay, so in May of 2014, we released this report, like I said, the Measuring Progress Towards Empowerment, and it summarizes country profiles for the 13 countries, but also what we did was to look at cross-country correlations between their WEAI scores, the WEAI indices, and their other outcomes that Feed the Future is interested in, like exclusive breastfeeding, minimum acceptable diet, women's dietary diversity, children's nutrition, anthropometry. So there are all these other sort of indicators that Feed the Future is collecting. And what we did was just try to see, is there a pattern? Do we see a relationship between countries that show high empowerment scores and these outcomes? And what we did find is that there are some really interesting correlations. So here's an example. So this is the summary of what the scores are across the countries. So we have the length of the bar is what we're calling a disempowerment score. So it's going down because it's disempowerment. So the longer it is, you want it to be higher, closer, high up here. So Bangladesh has the lowest score. Cambodia has the highest score. And what I wanted to point out here is just the range of index baseline disempowerment index scores, right? So ranging from here to all the way over there. The other thing I want to point out is that, so all the colors here represent the different indicators. Look at Nepal and Zambia. They have the same score, right? So if you look at just the disempowerment score, the empowerment score, they have the same score. You would think they had the same level of empowerment. But when you look at the composition, it's different. The constraints that are faced by women in Nepal is, what is this, group membership? Was very important. But in Zambia, not so much. Group membership was not a constraint. What's a bigger constraint to them was these, resources, or here, workload. So what is the policy implication? The program you would design for Nepal is very different from the program you would design for Zambia, right? So this emphasizes that idea that there is no cookie-cutter approach. But the nice thing about the index actually tells you where to focus. So that's the point I wanted to make here. And by the way, so this is for women, but we certainly have the same, you can do the same for men. And actually in the country profiles, you will see a comparison between the composition, the profile of disempowerment for women versus the men. And you can see where the gaps are and how they look like. When we look across the countries, the top contributors to this empowerment sort of are quite similar. So this is just sort of tallying, ranking them, the top contributors, right? 1, 2, 3. And these, we have the number of countries where this is a top constraint and the indicators total point count. So just looking here, access to and decisions on credit, group membership, and workload, where where indicators that are mentioned over and over again as a constraint in most countries. For women And even for men. So for men, credit as well. So both for men and women, credit was a key constraint. Group membership was a key constraint, but workload was more was more important for the men than for the women. I'll go back to the women. Oh no, it's workload too. So for all of them, it's the same. So this is a really interesting point. Because we have both the male and the female results, we can actually say, oh, they both have the same constraints. So if you design a project that looked at women only, you would run into some problems because the men, let's say a credit program just for the women, you would run into problems because the men also need the credit, right? So that gives you sort of an idea of how to structure your interventions. So yeah, so this is to say that, you know, they could have the same constraints or different constraints. Here are the correlations I was talking about. So for minimum acceptable diet and exclusive breastfeeding, there's a positive, so this is the regression line. There's a positive relationship between the outcome on the vertical axis and the WEAI score. So the higher the WEAI score, the more likely to have better nutrition outcomes. For the children? For the children, yes. This is, for here it's children under 2, and for here it's for children under 6 months. Very strong for exclusive breastfeeding. So the more women are empowered, the more likely they would be able to have exclusive breastfeeding for young kids. Education. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin. So household with no or primary education. So among households, so when the score is higher, so here we have the WEAI score in the vertical axis, and then education, the percent of households without with only primary education on the right hand side. So the more households have only primary education, the lower the WEAI score. Here we have secondary education. The higher the WEAI score, the higher the proportion of households with secondary education. So those are all sort of within expectations. Okay, so what has happened, some very exciting developments, you know, since the rollout of the WEAI was that, especially for Bangladesh, because remember they're at the bottom of that ranking. And there's actually a video of Mark, this USAID, one of the USAID persons in the mission, who was talking about how they knew that women were disempowered in Bangladesh, but they didn't know how bad it was. So having the index sort of helped quantify the scale of the problem, and because of that, they actually had a very active sort of response. First of all, they tried to retrofit existing programs. They were already sort of doing programs there. They said, okay, look, try to pay more attention to gender. It's now a requirement. All the partners have to take up activities that have a gender component. Okay, restored. Yeah, and restored. Okay. And then they also funded, they had a new, well, at the time, a new RFP for $6 million worth of new projects. So they had put out a new call that said, we need more women's empowerment projects, so send us your proposal. So they budgeted $6 million for new projects on top of what they were already doing. And then in addition to that, so right now, IFPRI is working with the Ministry of Agriculture in Bangladesh to orient agriculture towards nutrition and women's empowerment. So they're doing a pilot study with the government of Bangladesh to do an RCT to test alternative approaches on nutrition and women's empowerment. So all of these were sort of inspired by the responses, because remember, Bangladesh was the only, I think the only country that collected the WEAI at the nationally representative level. So not just the Feed the Future zone, they were actually able to collect it everywhere. So they can decompose, look at the different provinces or regions and see, you know, compare what is the nutrition here and what's empowerment here, and try to see, you know, how those things are related. So they really sort of took it on in terms of using the information they got from the index. So again, what gets measured gets done. Because they started measuring, now they have a better sense. They knew the scale of the problem that they needed to do. And so the other thing I wanted to say, and maybe the last thing before we break, we should probably break soon, was that, what was my point? Okay. I distracted myself. Oh, is that? Okay, that's not from here. Okay, so I was saying that Bangladesh did it. Oh, so their interim survey was just released, and actually there's a webinar by Akhtar Ahmed when he presented it at USAID a week or so ago, maybe just last week. He presented the interim survey results, and their WEAI scores have gone way up by an amazing amount. To be honest, when I was in Dhaka and they were just calculating it, they were so worried, and I was so worried that there was some sort of crazy mistake in the data, because it's like, this is so high, like it's impossible. I mean, I don't believe that it can increase that much in just 2-3 years. So we went through everything and tried to check their code. It's like, did something happen? Did we code 0 as 1 or the reverse? Like, what? There's something else going on, and we tried to check it, but it checks out. So he ended up presenting it, and they did more data checks, and it's robust. We changed the cutoffs. It's the same pattern. We look at the rest of the country. I think we haven't looked at the rest of the country. This is just the zone of influence, and it has increased. So I think with all of this sort of extra attention to gender, it's the other thing to say about Bangladesh is that they're coming from a very low base. So moving from a very low base to just some improvement, I think, was easier compared to, say, a country that already has somewhat high score, that's already closer to parity. To move that even more is more difficult. So they had a few things going for them, but that's a very interesting sort of outcome. So we're waiting now for the interim surveys to come back and see how what's been happening this past 2 years. So some of the recent developments in the index. Okay, so like I said, one of the things was that a lot of people were really excited about the WEAI, right? It's like, oh, finally a way to measure empowerment. And there was a lot. It was sort of, it had its own life. I mean, it had a life of its own. It just took off, and people started using it and tweaking it, doing different things. Now the problem is that, okay, just we like food analogies. Like I said, we're foodies. So this was an analogy that Agnes Kisumbing came up with. So it's like, think of the WEAI, the index, as an omelet. It has a recipe, right? There's a way to combine the information. It has a recipe. But you always need some standard ingredients. To call it an omelet, you need the eggs. If it doesn't have the egg, it's not an omelet. So it may look yellow, it may look omelet-like, but it's a tofu scramble. It's not an omelet. So a lot of people have been using it, but if they don't, for example, collect all the domains, or if they don't interview the men, they only ask the women, is it still a WEAI? When is an omelet still an omelet? So we had to come up with, sort of guidelines on what do we mean, what should it mean to use the tool, and how much can you change it. So there are two developments for that sort of came up since the launch, and I'm trying to see how we can take this out. Okay, so there are kind of two sets of developments. One of the main feedback that we got from the baselines was that it's too long. It's just too long. It costs too much. We're interviewing 2 people per household. We can't do it. So we need something shorter. We need something lighter. And that's where the abbreviated WEAI came from. So, people says, I really want to use the tool, but we don't have the resources to implement it in its current form. And that's why people drop indicators and they drop domains, because like, oh, I cannot collect time use, so I'll just not collect time use at all. I cannot see Bettina, so it's that. I can. Are you okay? Okay, you can see me. So it's like, they needed a short version. The other demand, the other request that we keep getting is that, okay, I'm working on a project, but my project doesn't look like Feed the Future, right? I'm doing I'm doing a different type of project, or I'm working more on nutrition, or I'm doing a value chain that's, kind of different from what Feed the Future is doing. My project has different objectives. It's not the same objectives that Feed the Future has. Can I still use the index? Or how should I change it so that it's relevant to my to my project. So this is where the idea of project level WEAI came up. And actually value chain projects is one of the categories. So, so like I said, right, so they've changed it around. So how far can adaptations go and still call it a WEAI? Okay, so what happened? So let's start with the abbreviated WEAI or the AWEAI. By the way, we had a contest to name that WEAI contest, and abbreviated WEAI won. So we're calling it abbreviated WEAI. So the goal of USAID was that they wanted to streamline the survey by around 30%. So they wanted a tool that was 30% shorter, faster than the original. And they also wanted to improve some of the more problematic modules. So, back in 2013, November 2013, after the first set of baselines were collected, we gathered everyone, all the implementing partners, all the users, the ad hoc adapters. We invited them all and says, okay, you've used it now. What do you think? Where are the problems? How can we improve? And these things always come up as problematic. Time use, autonomy, because I'll show you later what the questions look like. But autonomy was a problem. Credit, well, there was some issue with credit, but not that it was not difficult to implement, but there were some questions about credit. And speaking up in public, there were places where this was very political. That people, if they identify themselves as somebody who spoke up in public, they could be at risk. So they could not collect it. There was a country, Cambodia, they could not collect it at all. So we wanted to streamline the survey and sort of figure out a way to improve on these things. So we developed a pilot questionnaire based on all that feedback. As I said, we conducted cognitive testing. So one of the things they said was that, how do we know that women are really understanding what we mean, because we're using all these big jargony terms. We're using very abstract concepts. Do they really know, what are they talking about when they say they make decisions? So there was actually one country, Haiti, for their baseline, for the Feed the Future. The researchers who were collecting the survey took it upon themselves to do cognitive testing because they had doubts. So they said, okay, USAID is not requiring it, but let's try to do cognitive testing to see if we're going to find that people do understand what we mean. And they found some really interesting results, and that was one of the recommendations. So when we did our next pilot, we conducted cognitive testing. And then we did pilot field work in now 2 countries, Bangladesh and Uganda. For lack of resources, we couldn't do all 3 as before, but we chose the same countries and did it in the same zone and not necessarily in the same districts, but in the same sort of general area. And we also analyzed data from the pilot. So there are some suggestions that we could sort of see if it makes sense even without going to the field. So for example, somebody says, do we really need to ask separately whether a person can sell the asset, transfer the asset, bequeath the asset? These are all separate questions. Do I need to ask all 4 or buy the asset, or can I just combine it into one question? So we were like, let's look at the data and see if they're correlated. So when we looked at the data, we found that the transfer rights, purchase, sale, transfer, are correlated, highly correlated. Purchase is separate. So for here, we tried combining 3 and then keeping the other as separate. So we get rid of 2 questions, so it's a little easier. But yeah, so in some cases, to the extent we can use data from the pilots, we try that. The other thing we tried that used the data from the pilots was that people were complaining about time use module. They were like, it's so hard, primary versus secondary data. Do we really need to collect secondary activities? It's so complicated, and it messes them up because it's so hard to train enumerators to collect secondary time data. So we looked at the data and say, if we drop secondary activities from the definition of workload, will we get the same information? Okay, are women still empowered? And it turns out that an overworked person or a woman, an overworked woman is overworked whether or not you count secondary activities. So we had decided to try dropping it and see how much time we save by not collecting it and whether that was easier. So that's one of the things we tried. And what came out of this activity was that, so we conducted the second pilot. So if you look at the WEAI Resource Center, you will find links to data They will be distinguished by Pilot 1 and Pilot 2. Pilot 1 was the original pilot. Pilot 2 was this pilot that fed into the creation of the AWEAI. So this is slightly different. It's testing some new improvements in the questions. So in the end, we arrived at a version of the WEAI that has 6 indicators and streamlined questions. We also changed like formatting, extra instructions. There were some minor changes that were also, that came up from feedback that we had incorporated, even without changing the questions. It's like, well, if you just add this extra thing, it helps enumerators, so we added those things. And this is intended for use by USAID and their partners, other donors, and potentially national statistical systems for household surveys. Because if you want sort of eventually for the countries to be collecting this on their own in a regular basis, it has to be lighter. It has to be it has to be shorter so that they don't need too much resources to implement. So that they're one of the, this is one of the goals, was to try to see if countries themselves can collect this information. Oh, sorry. Okay, so what has changed? So in the original, so remember these are the 10 indicators and 5 domains. The indicators in the yellow are the indicators that were dropped. So autonomy in production, purchase, sale, transfer of assets, speaking in public, and satisfaction with leisure. Those were all dropped. For indicators. So we're left with 6. So basically 1 indicator per domain, except in resources where we still have assets and credit as separate indicators. And then the rest are, yes.
So this one now is, you're going to grade it 1/5?
Yes.
This is 1/10, 1/5.
Exactly. Yeah. And I should have a table. Okay. No. I have a table at the end with the, but you're right. So now, because you only have 1 indicator for the domain, it takes the full weight of that domain. So 1/5 here. Here you still have 2. So whereas before,
It was 1/15.
it's 1/15 each. Now here's the tricky part. In resources, and this was a big debate among the team, when we analyzed the data, like I said, purchase, sale, and transfer of assets we found to be correlated with ownership, but not necessarily with credit. So what we recommended was for ownership to proxy for these 2, right? So it takes on the weight of 2 of these 2. So this is 2/15, and credit remains the same. Credit is weighted as before, 1/15. So because what would have happened is that we would have weighted credit more in the new index. And we didn't want to do that because we thought that what we were dropping was not being reflected in credit because they were not very correlated. It was being reflected in ownership. So this is the only thing that was different. But every other domain has just 1 indicator left, and so it takes the full weight of the domain. So we measure workload using a 24-hour recall module, right? Time use module. And here we measure the amount of time spent of the person in work activities, and that could be paid or unpaid. So it's market and non-market work. So all the paid activities are included, as well as care, domestic chores, those kinds of things. Subsistence production is included in work. So if your workload for those market and non-market activities exceeds 10.5 hours per day, you're considered as time poor. So you are disempowered with respect to time. If the amount of time you spend is less than 10.5 hours, you're still considered empowered. Mm-hmm. Sorry?
The rest of the time.
That you're not working? Then it's you're either resting, it's leisure, you're socializing, other things. I mean, there's a complete list of activities that's in the time use module. But what we use for the indicator is only the time. Now, you still ask about, you don't ask each row. That's not how it's done. And actually, I have a video to show you about how to implement the time use module. It's a conversation about what time did you wake up this morning? And then what did you do? And for how long? And what else were you doing? When you were cooking, were you also listening to the radio? Were you taking care of a child? How much time? Until what time? Until call for prayer, until lunchtime, noontime. And then based on what the respondent says, we try to figure out how much time they spend on different activities. If there were secondary activities, if this were in the abbreviated, there's no more secondary activities, only primary. But in the original, we have primary and secondary activities, and we weight secondary activities as half. So we take the sum of your primary work time plus 50% of your reported secondary time. So if you said already 10 hours for just primary activities, but you were multitasking sometimes and you had 2 more hours where you were multitasking, it brings you over the threshold, and because of the secondary activities, you become disempowered now because we're weighting secondary activities as half. But in the abbreviated, like I said, we had dropped that because in general we found that it actually did not change people's ranking, whether or not they're disempowered. The other point was that secondary activities are actually very difficult to collect, and my suspicion is that we're not measuring it, it's underreported still. So there is secondary activities, but we're not capturing it enough to make a difference. So better not capture it, there's no point in collecting it. Okay? Okay, great. So I didn't realize that this was for Bangladesh. I meant to switch it out to Uganda, but this is just an idea of what it looks like to compare the index with 10 indicators versus 6 for women and for men using the second pilot data. So you can see that the trends are sort of the same in terms of which are the most important contributors to this empowerment. So the profiles, there's some changes in the numbers, but in general the pattern seems the same, especially for the most important indicators, like these things. Okay, pros and cons. Obviously, why use the WEAI? Shorter administration time, less resources. It does not include some of the problematic modules. So we had dropped the ones that people complained about. We dropped autonomy. People complained about speaking in public. We dropped that. We took out secondary activities. When compared to the original using second pilot data, the top 2 constraints remain the same. So if you were using this just to see what was the biggest gap, abbreviated is fine. It shows you generally the same information as the full. But some cons. Fewer indicators of empowerment. It's dropping 4 indicators, so you have less information. It's only comparable to the baselines. Okay, this is very important. If analysis is restricted to the 6 indicators, if you want to compare this with your baseline, and your baseline is based on 10, you have to recalculate your baseline to make it 6, so that you're comparing 6 and 6. You cannot compare them directly, so there's an extra step when you're trying to do analysis. When compared to the original, using the second pilot, one of the top 3 indicators contributing to women's and men's disempowerment changed. So this is what I said. If you're using it to rank priorities, and it matters to you what's the third most important, or how these things are in terms of priority, it's not as fine, it's coarser information. The full WEAI was more granular, more finer information. And as we said, the more disaggregated one can be aggregated back up, but you cannot do the reverse. So this one gives you cruder data on empowerment. And the caveat, pilots are based on small samples in 2 countries. Results are indicative. Results are indicative, especially with respect to this. It's like we did this exercise to test the questions. This was not intended as a validation of the index. We're just testing which question worked better. So the sample size is still small. So we're actually waiting to get interim surveys so that we could do more validation once we get a broader set of countries with different contexts, because that's always an issue, right? We only did it for 2 countries, whereas the original pilot was 3. Okay, so I think this is a good place to break. I think I was going to outline what the key changes were in the abbreviated WEAI compared to the original. So I was going to show you here what were some of the findings in the pilot and why we decided to keep or drop, what sort of changes, improvements did we make. Other questions before it's almost, I think it's like almost 1, so we should be getting ready for lunch. And then when we come back, so we'll go over what were the modifications in the second pilot. I'll talk about Project WEAI, and then we'll get into the questionnaire and implementation. All right. So in production, so remember there are two indicators. So what we did here, no significant modifications because people's experiences was that it worked pretty well. The only thing we had tried was in autonomy in production. We tested the original questions against a series of vignettes. And vignettes are short stories that try to capture the more other. And this is a way to try to make the abstract concepts more concrete. So this was something very new that we tried. So we did vignettes, and I'll show an example later. And it actually worked very well. The respondents really liked the stories because it sort of broke the monotony of the interview. It was a different format. They enjoyed it, so it's like they were just chatting. The enumerators also liked it. It created rapport. The bad news is that it took longer because they kept chatting. And it's like, oh, tell me again about the story. So they liked it. They think it worked better. They think the respondents understood it better. So according to our field teams, they're like, we would trust information from this more than the original questions. But it does not help us with cutting by 30%. The other thing was that we thought this was a good start, but that we could make it better. So it needed more experimentation, but it was heading in the right direction. So in the end, we decided to drop it. So we kept the original first indicator. We dropped the second. So here's what it looks like. The original WEAI autonomy questions are, okay, the set of, okay, I'm not going to read it because I'm trying to conserve my voice, but so you have the 4 different areas, right? Getting inputs, types of crops to grow, taking crops to market, and livestock raising. My actions in this activity are partly because I will get into trouble with someone if I ask differently. Is this always true, somewhat true, not very true, or never true? Regarding this aspect, I do what I do so others don't think poorly of me. And then regarding this aspect, I do what I do because I personally think it's the right thing to do. We ran into a lot of problems with this because the enumerators couldn't understand the questions, the respondent couldn't understand, they couldn't explain it to the respondent, and in some countries especially, this was very, very hard with translation. So it's so hard to translate as well because it would seem to be very abstract. Okay, what did we do? So we did vignettes. So here, instead of that set of questions, we say, let's say Seema or Lillian. Lillian can't grow other types of crops here for consumption and scale in market. Beans, sweet potato, and maize are the only crops that grow here. Are you like this person? Yes or no? Are you completely the same? So if they say yes, I'm like this person, are you completely the same or somewhat the same? And if they say, I'm completely the same, okay, then you go to the next story. Lillian is a farmer and grows beans, sweet potato, and maize because her spouse or another person or group in her community tells her she must grow these crops. She does what they tell her to do. Are you like this person? Yes or no? Are you completely the same or somewhat the same? And then if they say, no, I'm not like this person, they say, are you completely different or somewhat different? So that's how we get to the always true, not very true, very true. So the ultimate response here, it becomes the score becomes one of these scores, right? So here, each cell here would have a score. Here, the ultimate response is this one score. So it's longer. It looks longer because here you have it in separate stories. So the third story, Lillian grows the crops for agricultural production that her family or community expects. She wants them to approve of her as a good farmer. And then the last story is, which is the intrinsic value, anyway, I forgot what it's called, intrinsic value. Lillian chooses the crops that she personally wants to grow for consumption and sale in the market and thinks are best for her family and business. She values growing these crops. If she changed her mind, she could act differently. So this is the most empowered sort of story. And these responses here are not mutually exclusive because everybody has mixed motivations, right? It's just trying to get at the relative importance of these motivations for the different types of activities. And so they do this, and you can imagine it takes a long time. But it's more fun. It's more fun than responding to other parts of the questionnaire. So we think this actually has a lot of potential. So, okay, now the reason I show you this one, first one, Lillian can grow other types of crops for consumption. Bean, sweet potato, and maize are the only crops that grow here. This is the situation that reflects the point that actually this is not an area where I can exercise autonomy. There are gender norms about what I should do, and I just follow it, right? This is not something I can change, or this is not in my realm of actions, yeah? Because one of the criticisms we got about the autonomy, the motivation question, was that agriculture in many places is a household sort of activity, or it's very much, it very much relies on the agroecological sort of situation. So if mung beans are the only things that grow in my crop, it doesn't make sense if you ask me if I can make a choice to what to grow. Only mung beans will grow here. So yeah, so the reason and I'll get to you later, but let me just finish this point. We include this so that we can validate that, see, is it true? If people say that I'm like this person, the one who cannot actually exercise autonomy here, then maybe we shouldn't be asking them this autonomy question. This is not a place they're exercising autonomy. So we're trying to see if that's true. But we actually don't use this in the calculation. This is not required. This is just to see if that criticism holds and whether it holds for both countries. Yes, Titi. So these revised questions are in the abbreviated for sure, but also in what we call the 1.1 with vignettes. So what happened was that, so we have the original WEAI, right? We call that 1.0. That's the first version. When we did this next pilot, after we got some feedback, we realized there were some changes that we could improve on without changing any questions. We could change format, we could change, some response codes. It doesn't change the question, it doesn't change the way it's asked. So we consider it still version 1, but there are some slight changes that it's an improvement. So we call that 1.1. Now here we were convinced that these vignettes were way better than the original autonomy questions, that in addition to those minor tweaks, we went ahead and swapped out the vignettes for the original. It's like, if you're starting from scratch, start with the vignettes. Don't bother with the other version because it was too abstract. You're going to run into problems. You wouldn't know anyway what you're getting. This one is more reliable. So there's a version 1.0. There's a version 1.1, which is 10 indicators with improvements. Same questions, but the only difference is the vignettes part. But everything else has the same questions. It's scored the same. It measures the same indicators. Even this, it looks different, but it's scored the same. And then there's a version, what we call version 2.0. That is the pilot version 2.0. The pilot version has all the new questions we tried in the pilot. Those survived into the abbreviated version. But the pilot has 10 questions still. 2.0 has still the 10 questions. So I know it sounds complicated, so that's why we came up with the versions table. So what are the versions? And what are the differences? So in this handout, you have the background, the domains covered, indicators covered, what is the survey instrument that's associated with it, pros and cons, and there's another. Is it comparable to the future ones? What are the weights? What are the cutoffs? And can this be called the WEAI? So we try to make it as user-friendly as possible so that you're not confused which version to use. But yes, all of these modifications survived. So these are the A-WEAI of modifications. So the A-WEAI would already include all, because if you already know better, we have a better way of asking the question. Why would we go back and recommend the old way to other people? No. We use the better version. So for example, SEMA, so this is exactly that first story. SEMA can't grow because these are the only crops that grow here. Okay. So here are the distribution of responses. This is the story that describes the person who has no options. I cannot make a decision here. If this was true, we expect a huge percent of the respondents to say this is always true or somewhat true. But instead we find that most people say never true and not very true. So we reject this criticism because it's like actually they can exercise autonomy. according to their results. Okay, so that's the production domain. In the resource domain, so we have 3 indicators, right? Ownership, rights over assets, and credit. So in the ownership, we actually changed the definition. So before the question was who owns most, now we ask, do you own any? And then we eliminate the question of the number of assets. Now, one of the reasons we did this is a recommendation by Cheryl Doss that we took on, is that we wanted the information from the WEAI to be as useful in many different ways as possible. Though the previous way we were asking it, who owns most, we could not construct land tenure statistics using this data. You would have needed a second questionnaire or a second set of questions. If you ask, do you own any, then actually I can actually calculate the number of women and the number of men who own land. And that's very useful for the national government especially, right? So we want this to be as useful to as many people as possible. So even though it is used for the index, they could also use it in other ways that would make it comparable to other surveys. So that's why we made that change. I already talked about this. This was found to be correlated, so I won't belabor that point. On credit, the problem was that we only asked them if the household has access to borrowed, and if they borrowed, did they participate in decisions around whether to borrow and what to do with the money or with the whatever they borrowed. If they did not borrow, there are many reasons why they did not borrow. Maybe they did not borrow because they didn't want to borrow. They already had other sources of financing, or they didn't like the interest rate. There are many possible reasons, not because they could not have done so. So maybe it doesn't tell us that they don't have access to credit. So that was a key issue. So we added a question on hypothetical borrowing. So which of the, if you wanted to borrow, could you from these different sources? And if you say yes, then we don't count you as empowered, even if you don't have a loan in the past year. So we kept ownership, we dropped this, and then on credit, we just added one question. So very straightforward. Okay, and this is just the correlations that show the analysis and why we dropped rights over assets. I think this is not very controversial. So I'm gonna, unless there's some question, I can keep going. Okay, let me just keep going. You can look at this later before bedtime. Okay, so in the original question, so just to show you, right? So before the original question was, who would you say owns most of the item? And you have the different categories. This is just part of the questionnaire, right? It goes on to many different types of assets. Who would you say owns most? Now, we say, does anyone in your household have this, and do you own any of it? So yes solely, yes jointly, or no. So it's simpler, and you can actually have an option to either say yes solely, yes jointly, and you just circle the response. Okay. If you have multiple land and you own one solely and one jointly, you can circle them both. So there's an explicit instruction that you can circle all that are applicable. Okay. Yes. Oh, so this is self-reported.
That was going to be my question.
Yeah, no, this is self-reported ownership. So we're not asking them if they have a title. We're not because we're trying to get at access and use rights. So if they report that they own part of it, they feel they own however it is they think they own it, whether they have a title or not, we count it. So we use a broad definition. Yeah. Okay, income. Also very yeah?
But when I look at the categories, you have an option for other, because I can solely have.
Oh no, there it goes all the way to J. Yeah, this is just to show you what the question was. Yeah, it's an exhaustive. Okay, for income, we didn't ask new questions, but we actually streamlined it. So what we did was, before, this was in 2 separate sections of the questionnaire, which made it really complicated to teach because it's so hard to explain that, okay, this part comes from here and that part goes to there. So what we did was to combine all the decision questions on production in one page, so that when you're being asked about crops, you answer all the questions about crops. You don't have to go back to it later. So we thought that was more consistent. It's not clear though if it saved time, but we think it flows better. So how does it look? So before, in the original, So like I said, there's two parts. So here, for every activity, you're asked, do you participate? How much input do you have in decisions? And then how much input did you have in decisions on the use of income generated from this activity? So that's the first part. The second part is in this decision-making section, G5, where about wage employment and expenditure categories. We ask who makes decisions and to what extent do you feel you can make your own personal decisions regarding this if you wanted to. And I want to explain this a little bit more because it's a mouthful and it's actually a hard concept. It's a rather complex concept. The idea why we have a hypothetical question here is that not everybody values the same decisions. So if I don't make a decision about minor household expenditure, not because I cannot do it, but because I've delegated it to my wife, she takes care of it. But if I wanted to tell her what to spend on or to contribute to that decision, I couldn't. So that's different. Even if I'm not the decision maker, I can make the decision. So that person is still empowered. So we count it here, right? There are some decisions that that vary along gender lines. So maybe, you know, what food is prepared. I don't, you know, the man may not, or even for the woman too. It's like, you know, what things about education, let's say. She says, well, you know, my husband decides on that, but if I wanted if I had a different opinion, I could. If I wanted to, then she's empowered compared to the person who actually does not participate, right? So that's why we have these parts. But anyway, this is the other part about income. So we have these income and expenditure categories where we try to use that information to add to the income indicator. That was the original way. The new way, it's just all combined. So when you ask them about the different activities, did you participate? When decisions are made, who makes the decision? So you already know who's the main decision maker. How much input did you have in making decisions? To what extent do you feel you can make decisions if you wanted to? And how much input did you have on the use of income? So it's sort of more streamlined. It's all in one page, and you don't need to go back to certain issues later on. So yeah.
When you say how much input did you make, or what do you expect them to give you? A figure, 10% of the decision?
No. There's a scale that's doesn't show here. Yeah, no, it's only how much. I think it's small, medium, high extent.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like this. I forget the exact codes, but it should be in your handout. Yeah. And then again, here we put in, you know, circle all applicable. So here we already identify if the self. So if self is highlighted or is circled, or self with others, as long as they're the primary decision maker, we already assume, we skip the next two. We already assume that they're making decisions, they're already coded as empowered. We don't need to ask them questions. So there's also that skip pattern. Okay. Okay, leadership. So two indicators, group membership and speaking in public. And like I said, speaking in public, we ended up dropping it. But we actually tried some new questions. So one of the problems with this is that some of the context, so the way it's asked is, to what extent do you feel comfortable speaking in public in deciding public investments in your community, or to complain about the wage of, or to complain about a government employee, things like that. And these are, in some places it's fine, in some places these are very touchy subjects. So we changed the question to make it seem more general because it was quite sensitive. And in the end, it worked better. So it was an improvement. It worked better. But we ended up dropping it in the end because still for some, it could not be overcome that for some countries they could not measure. So we just dropped it. We kept group membership because that was actually, people have been collecting group membership already and it was not difficult to collect. Okay, time. So this is the one of the most complicated changes because there were a lot of complaints and there were a lot of things we tried. So one of the things we tried here was to change it from 24-hour recall to a 7-day recall. And we collected both actual and typical. So we asked them, in the last 7 days, how much time did you spend on different categories. And we only ask about the work categories. So we don't ask about the ones that are not required to calculate the index. So it's a shorter set of activities. We ask them for the last 7 days, and then we ask them, was last week typical or not? If they say it's not typical, then how much time do you spend in a typical week? So both of those things were collected. Now, to compare that, we also collected the same 24-hour recall as before with both primary and secondary activities, as well as just primary, dropping the secondary. So we calculated all those and compared. I forgot to mention that when we did the pilot, one of the things, because we were trying to cut by 30%, right? We actually have time checks for each submodule because we wanted to see how long did this question take. So we had time checks for each submodule. And then also what we did was we had 2 versions. So as I was describing earlier, and I think I should have mentioned it then, for the pilot, we have per country about 350 households. We split the sample into 2 and then randomly assigned either original or new version. So one half of the sample got 1.1, one half of the sample got 2.0. So it's even smaller for each subgroup. Huh? So for one half of the sample, they got the original 24-hour recall with primary and secondary activities. And then for the other half, they got the 7-day recall and the shorter 24-hour recall. Okay, what happened? Leisure, no change. What happened? Did it save time? Because this is when people were saying that, oh, why don't you just do 7-day recall and then it will be, and then it's shorter, it'll save time. No, it did not save time. It was longer and more error. So it's not faster. And enumerators hated it because they had to compute, well, respondents hated it because first of all, they could not recall what happened in the last 7 days. It's hard enough to remember what happened yesterday, but to happen what happened in the past week. And then if it's not typical in a typical week, what happens? Oh my goodness, the cognitive burden is really immense. Now, of course, the enumerator has to help them respond. So they have to be enumerate. They have to calculate, okay, so you went to get the firewood like 3 times a week and it takes you this much. And if it's a rainy season and it takes longer, and I mean, it's complicated. So it took longer. Okay, so scratch that, and we have the data to prove it that it didn't work. So one key limitation of a time use module is that it does not capture agricultural seasonality, and that's a big problem. So you either have to go back every season because you want to capture those variations, or you just you're stuck with the season where you decide to go. So obviously, if you're interested in that, you wouldn't go in that season where nobody's doing anything. You want to go in the season where things are happening. If you're trying to understand how much time you're spending on agriculture, right?
If you have lots of time for the survey.
Well, that's the other thing, right? So you decide. I mean, you can decide when the survey happens. Sometimes it's not your decision. It's because the donor needs it done, or the impact, the evaluation needs to happen, or the baseline needs to happen by a certain time. You just need to go to the field. You get what you get, right? But the idea is that here, in terms of the 7-day versus the typical, you would be clear that because you want this to be comparable, you're asking for the typical in the same season that we're talking about when you're reporting the 7 days. So this is a stylized time use module. And there's, a lot of people use this in agricultural surveys too, but here for us, it didn't work as well because of the numeracy issues, but also recall, and there was a lot of measurement error. The range of, and I have a table after this actually to show you that the range of responses was, they report working way longer hours in their estimates compared to what they would have reported if they used only 24 hours. So both the field teams, so it's like, okay, those recommendations, good suggestions, we tried them, we still like the original way we do it, except we just dropped secondary activities. But the surprise was that people were so convinced that if we stopped collecting secondary activities, this would be less time. It saved 2 to 3 minutes
Only
per survey. Yeah, 2 to 3 minutes. So it's like, okay, it saved you some time, but not a whole lot. But still, okay, if it simplifies things, then we take it off. What is secondary activities? Secondary activities is when you're multitasking. So you're doing something, but at the same time period, you're doing something else, a secondary activity. Okay. So here's the average work hours by method, right? So we have pilot 1.1, pilot 2.0. So we have primary and secondary, or primary only, actual, typical, or primary only. And here, if you look at, so this is the 24-hour week. If you look here, 9.8 versus for the men, for the women, 11 versus 8.8, 9 versus 10. So much higher, especially for Bangladesh was not so bad, but for Uganda, the differences are huge, right? Look at those. So, okay, so just to summarize, here are the original with the ones that were dropped with the weights, and here the new weights, okay, and the new set of indicators. Okay, all right. So how will it be used? So, okay, so a few possibilities. So we already talked about this. So you have a Feed the Future will continue, USAID will continue to use it after 2017, because in 2017 their end lines, they're going to collect the same tool they collected in the baseline so they can compare. But after that, and for other partners, they're free to use the abbreviated WEAI. We want national householder agricultural surveys to explore using it. And the third is as a component of the new Pro WEAI or Project WEAI. So the reason another benefit of having something short is that you can have this short thing and then we can just add on. So you have like a core module, that's the idea, is to have some sort of basic set of empowerment questions that are shorter, and then depending on your project focus, you could just add what you need, right? So that was the idea. So it could be a component of the new Project WEAI. And now there are all these, and so here I'm moving now to the project WEAI. So there you have all these adaptations, right? And we pose the question: when is an omelette still an omelette? Is it a WEAI if you modify the survey instrument? What do you think? Oh, perfect. Good answer. It depends, like a good economist. Possibly. It depends, depending on what was modified. So you cannot change the questions, you cannot drop the questions, but you can change the types of assets. If there's a major asset that's important in your context, or there's an asset that doesn't make sense, or there is no fishing in this context and there's a fishing line there, you can take that out. You can drop it. You can drop the rows, but not change the questions. Is it a WEAI if you drop or add indicators? Okay, we're kind of going into this. If you keep the 5 domains, it could be a WEAI because the abbreviated WEAI drops some indicators, but it keeps the 5 domains. So that's the crucial part. So the omelette needs to have eggs. So the 5 domains are the eggs. Okay, is it a WEAI if you drop a domain? And we already answered that question. No, you cannot. So a lot of people say, oh, I'm using the WEAI, and they didn't collect time. They didn't collect these. They actually only asked one question or a few questions, and then, of course, they cannot calculate the index. So they cannot. Sorry, there was a conflict. You can add a domain because you can always calculate it based on the, remember, if you have more data, you can always restrict. But if you have less data, you cannot, invent the other categories. Okay, so many flavors, how to choose. So I referred you to the table, right? So there are different versions. So you could take a look at that and see which are the pros and cons. What are you giving up when you use the abbreviated versus not? And some of you may be interested in the Project WEAI because that sounds much more flexible. But remember, flexible doesn't mean short, right? Because when you say, oh, but this is important and that's important, that's a longer survey. So your expectations have to be aligned, right? You cannot collect everything that's relevant and make it short, right? The decisions have to be made. And it says here, but waiter, Pro WEAI isn't even on the menu. It's not because it's under development. So they're working on it now. And let me give you an overview of what's happening in this project. So like I said, what the projects want, they want something streamlined, easier to collect, that can be part of regular M&E. So here, it's important for it to be agile. Like they want something that moves quickly, an indicator that changes quickly, that they can detect change in shorter period of time, that they could adapt to a regular M&E. They want something they could adapt to their project context. Different projects have they can look very different. They can look very different from FTF. So they want to be able to incorporate their own project goals. it should have better understanding of qualitative aspects of empowerment, the how and the why, not just measuring what is the empowerment score, but why is that and how can we change it. So in some cases, there are modules that we're developing modules that are related to mobility, violence, reproductive health, or projects could be interested in these things like political participation, self-confidence, but this is not in the current tool. So they'd want to add sort of information on other domains or other dimensions that's not strictly captured in the WEAI as it is now. So this is what projects want to do. So, you know, they would add some detail. So if it's a livestock project, you could add more detail on different types of livestock, or less so for other things that you're not focusing on. It extends beyond agriculture. So if you're interested, for example, in non-farm activities and how that's relating to your program, it's not only agriculture that maybe you want to pay attention to. Maybe greater emphasis on autonomy in other spheres, and this is what I was talking about earlier. Maybe control over income was a more appropriate place to ask about autonomy, or participation in the labor force. Are you able to make decisions on starting up a business or participating in this livelihood or that livelihood? Not just about production in agriculture. And again, other dimensions. So how do you do all of this? Projects want a lot of things. How do you do this but still have comparability? And how do you do this so that we can learn from each other and understand what strategy works best without having the metrics all over the place and different projects using different versions of the metrics? So it's like, you know, 10,000 flavors of the WEAI and none of them sort of look the same. So what do we do next? So so fortunately, IFPRI has experience from what we call the GAP project, the Gender, Agriculture, and Assets project. There's some wonderful workshops that has happened in the first phase. So for Project WEAI, a second phase has been approved. This is, and I have the donors later. So this builds an approach on the approach of the first set of the first GAP. So there will be a portfolio of projects. So it has to be done in a portfolio approach because everybody sort of develops it simultaneously. So there's going to be a portfolio of 10 to 14 projects in some focus countries, and they would be, so the GAP2 team in IFPRI will be working with these projects to develop a WEAI for projects use. So there was a call that came out. The call is now closed. The project is now ongoing. So the projects have been selected. I think they have 13 projects. So what kind of projects are in this project? So so this is funded by the Gates Foundation, USAID, and the CGIAR Research Program on Agriculture for Nutrition and Health. So there's sort of this matrix of project description. No? So you have either a crop project or a livestock or dairy project, and then you either have, so these are the interventions, you have either a nutrition or health objective or a value chain income objective. And they sort of try to fill up these cells and make sure they have enough examples for each cell. What they discovered, so they thought this project would fit neatly into this 2x2 matrix, and quickly they discovered that projects were much more complicated, and they had a third category, which is both combined all of these objectives, or combined crop and livestock projects, things like that. So there's quite a lot of blending, you know, within the two. Okay, so the team is developing this tool together with these projects, and then so they're going to put piloting it, and will be added on. So there will be add-on modules that will be added onto a core set of original WEAI modules. So there's going to be a core part that will be required for everyone. Everybody's going to collect a minimum set of questions that will be comparable everywhere, and then there are some add-ons that people can opt into. And the way that's going to be folded into the index, we're still figuring it out. But the OFI people are part of the project, and they're the index people. They're the experts in the methodology and how to maintain the properties at the same time allowing for that flexibility. Okay. So one thing I really wanted to share with you about GAP2, and the reason I talked to you about it here now, is that there is going to be a community of practice around this. So what is it? So there's going to be a virtual space for Project WEAI, and what do you get? So it's like, you think of it as a test kitchen. So the people in the portfolio are the projects who are in the test kitchen. They're testing out new recipes, or they're in the actual kitchen. They're making the new omelette. They're trying different flavors, adding on here, taking off there. So if you're in the community of practice, your role is you can download recipes that they have tried. So they have tried this recipe, it's amazing, try it. Okay, so this looks like something you can use, then you can try it. So as part of that community, you have the opportunity to sort of use what they have, what they have tried. And so this is going to be facilitated by a professional collaboration team. This is not yet set up because there's nothing to share yet. They're still in the test kitchen. So as soon as there are modules that are ready for other people to use, it will include, manuals and other things. And I think there should be like webinars and other things like that. Those will all be shared in the community of practice. So if you're interested, you can apply in the gap.ifpre.info page so that they could include you in the mailing list that gets the announcement of once it's set up and getting the updates on that. Okay, what version should you use? It depends on what your goals are. Are you doing a population-based survey? If that's the case, then the Feed the Future sort of version might work. The 10 indicate the 1.1 WEAI with vignettes might work. If you are, maybe you're trying to do something, you don't have a lot of budget, or you're doing it as part of a national agricultural survey, you need something shorter, you can use the abbreviated version. If you're not using it as a diagnostic, you can use the shorter version. If you're just using it to quick monitoring, you can use the shorter version. Or you need something intervention specific, so that's the project way, right? So here's just an outline of how it's different from each other. 1.0 is the original. This is what the baselines collected. 1.1 is slightly modified, so it changes in format, response codes, more instructions, autonomy questions replaced with vignettes. This is collected for the Feed the Future midline survey. So the midline survey is already using the 1.1. So both of these have 5 domains, 10 indicators. They're comparable, yes. The autonomy is the only ones that actually change, but we feel comfortable using those two, saying that they're comparable, because either you trust your original data or you don't, in which case, you interpret at your own risk. So, but in any case, we say, okay, in general, you can use those two, as long as because they both have 10 indicators. So this is very comprehensive, but could take long to administer. It takes about 30-40 minutes per respondent. So you're interviewing both men and women. If you're interviewing them simultaneously with 2 enumerators, it's 30-40 minutes per household. If you have to do them one after the other, then it feels longer than that. Abbreviated WEAI is 30% shorter. Problematic modules were dropped. Now 6 indicators instead of 5 domains still, but 6 instead of 10 indicators. And then again, if you want to compare to the original, make sure you recalculate your originals to only reflect the 6. Project WEAI is project or activity level WEAI. It uses a WEAI as the starting point. It adds intervention-specific modules and questions, comparable to other projects' activities working on similar interventions. And this is how we can find out what strategies work. So all the dairy projects can have the same index. All the livestock projects, all the crop projects, or value chain projects can compare themselves to other value chain projects. So it's under development. It will be available in the resource center. And all these things will be made available. Okay, so final thoughts, key messages on this. Measuring women's empowerment is needed for monitoring progress, and that's why we attempt to measure it. The tool is constantly evolving. It's changing. We're trying to do better, but so it's not the final word, and it's not perfect as it is. It's never going to be perfect, but if we don't measure, we're not going to know what works. There are many different versions to suit your needs. Like, there's a menu now of different flavors of WEAI, so choose the one that fits your needs. And all are encouraged to join the ProWEA. If you don't find what you want from the index in the current pools, then join our community and let us know what needs to be in there. Participate. So I think that's it. Thank you.